Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. In the final years of his clinical life, the pioneering psychologist Carl Jung spent a massive amount of time documenting a phenomenon that medical science literally didn't even have a name for. He observed it repeatedly across decades of patient files, and honestly, it led him to a deeply unsettling conclusion about human nature. He found that highly perceptive people, the ones who clearly see the hidden psychological truths in the rooms they enter, are almost never rewarded for their sight. In fact, they face a quiet collective punishment.
Now, what's really fascinating about this idea is the deep validation it offers. I mean, if you've ever walked into a room and felt the entire energy suddenly shift against you, or if you've been labeled as difficult simply for pointing out an obvious truth that literally everyone else was ignoring, you are absolutely not crazy. Jung found that this is a documented, highly predictable psychological collision. It's basically the punishment for carrying the weight of seeing what the people around you've collectively agreed not to see.
To really understand this, let's look at an anonymous patient from Jung's clinical notes way back in 1913. This woman wasn't delusional, she wasn't broken. Rather, she was wide awake in a world that had organized itself entirely around sleep. She could just sense things, concealed grief, resentment hiding right beneath warm words, or the deep anxiety masking itself as a confident voice, all before a single word was even spoken. But this capacity cost her dearly. She couldn't hold down a job or maintain ordinary friendships because, well, as Jung noted, ordinary relationships demand that we mutually honor each other's masks, and she just couldn't pretend not to see through them.
So we have to ask, why does this actually happen? Jung borrowed this brilliant concept from the French anthropologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl called participation mystique. Originally, this was used to describe how individuals in traditional communities completely merge their identities with the tribe. But Jung realized, wait a minute, this isn't just an ancient concept, this is the default human condition today. Most modern groups naturally default to this fused state. They operate on shared, entirely unconscious agreements about what is real, and more importantly, what absolutely must remain hidden.
In practice, these unconscious agreements are quite literally everywhere. It's the family that completely ignores the father's drinking at the dinner table. It's the corporate organization that just won't name the leader's blatant narcissism. It's a tight-knit friend group ignoring a predatory relationship right at its center. There's no formal meeting where everyone decides to do this. The core invisible rule is simply, we do not see this. And so, the highly perceptive person creates a devastating collision because they just cannot unsee the truth. They can't honor the pact. When a perceptive person reflects these unacknowledged truths, what Jung called the shadow, back to the group, the collective unconscious is forced to make a really difficult choice. It can either look in the mirror and integrate that uncomfortable truth, or it can attack the mirror. And, as Jung observed, human beings will attack the mirror almost every single time. This is the classic scapegoat mechanism. The group preserves its cozy, agreed-upon blindness by punishing the one person who is making that blindness impossible to maintain.
Over time, this dynamic builds into a very predictable and frankly tragic cycle. At first, the perceptive person is actually highly valued. They're the trusted one, relied upon to navigate complex group dynamics and sense conflicts before they blow up. But as the collective shadow grows heavier and the group's dysfunction becomes harder to ignore, the perceptive person's mere presence becomes a quiet indictment. Without ever changing who they are, their accuracy is suddenly branded as arrogance. Their observations are called drama. They become the target, quickly labeled as difficult or disloyal.
This whole process leads to a profound sense of existential isolation. In Jung's notes, he talks about multiple patients reporting the exact same recurring dream. They're standing inside a well-lit, animated room full of people, but they're experiencing the entire scene through a thick pane of glass. They can see every single dynamic playing out, but they are completely locked out of the shared illusion. And the kicker? The glass isn't put there by others. It's just the natural consequence of having a level of consciousness that makes merging with the group's blind spots entirely impossible.
But here's the hopeful part. Jung didn't view this isolation as some permanent life sentence. Not at all. He saw it as a required threshold that you absolutely must cross on the path to what he called individuation, which is basically developing a fully realized self that stands distinct from the collective crowd. However, to cross this threshold and avoid a complete psychological collapse, the perceptive person has to confront three very specific, very severe dangers.
Let's lay these out. There are three core dangers unintegrated people face when navigating these unconscious systems: collective disruption, psychological isolation, and identity dissolution. Let's break down exactly why these are so incredibly destabilizing.
Danger 1 is that simply by being authentically present, you naturally disrupt avoidance systems. The group blames you for the dysfunction you are merely revealing. Danger 2 is the psychological isolation that inevitably follows. Think about it. When you spend years accurately perceiving reality, only to be constantly invalidated and gaslit by the people around you, it creates this corrosive, global mistrust of your own mind. You actually begin to doubt your own internal compass, treating your accuracy like it's some sort of liability.
And that brings us to Danger 3, which is the terrifying, extreme identity dissolution. This happens when a perceptive person spends so much time absorbing the unacknowledged emotional residue of everyone around them, literally carrying the shadow that no one else will take responsibility for, that they actually lose the thread back to their own authentic self. They simply collapse under the sheer weight of being the only conscious person in a totally unconscious system.
To combat this collapse, Jung heavily stressed the urgent need for what we could call psychic hygiene. He analyzed a patient's dream, where she was looking down into a vast body of still water. The surface reflected her own face, but down in the deep water she saw the faces and fragments of everyone else's unacknowledged truths that she had been absorbing. Jung told her straight up, "You can't stay safely on the shore forever. You have to learn to enter the water to distinguish your own genuine psychological truth from the muddy residue of everyone else's."
Jung loved to frame this painful process of integration through the metaphor of alchemy. Another patient dreamed of calmly walking through a burning house. Jung explained to him that the fire wasn't destroying him, it was refining him. This is the Negredo stage, that intense burning fire clearing away all the carried shadow and junk absorbed from others. Once you move through the clear settling of the albedo stage, you finally reach the rubedo. This is where you emerge from the fire, not numbed, not hardened and bitter, but fully integrated, warm and wholly yourself.
Now, this deeply transformative journey perfectly mirrors the ancient seer archetype we find all over mythology, from Cassandra to Tiresias. The seer's eyes are wide open, while the rest of the tribe's eyes are squeezed shut. But Jung noted something truly fascinating here. The mythological tragedy of the seer was never actually the sight itself. The tragedy was always a lack of integration. I mean, Cassandra's curse wasn't that she could see the future. Her curse was that she frantically tried to force that sight onto people who had securely closed their eyes.
To really grasp the danger of forcing that sight, just look at how history played out for two brilliant minds. Take Friedrich Nietzsche, for example. He possessed extraordinary perception but severely lacked humility. He wielded his sight like a weapon against everyone else, his ego massively inflated, and his mind ultimately collapsed. This is what we call the dangerous prophet complex. But then compare that to the mystic Meister Eckhart. He had an equally rare level of perception, but he held it with conscious humility. He didn't force his insight on anyone. He offered it as a gift, simply creating the space for awareness to blossom naturally. Which brings us right to the core challenge of shadow integration. You really have to ask yourself, can you see your own shadow as clearly as you see theirs? Jung pointed out a brutal paradox here. The people who most clearly see the manipulation or arrogance in others are very often the ones who haven't examined their own need for control or superiority. If you don't do that deep interior work, your perception is basically like looking out of a window covered in the fingerprints of your own unexamined shadow. The view outside is real, sure, but it is deeply, deeply distorted.
But if you can pass through that alchemical fire and actually integrate your own shadow, you reach Jung's ultimate goal, the transcendent function. At this stage, your perceptive gift is no longer this heavy, exhausting burden that you just barely survive. It's no longer a wound. And it's certainly not a weapon you wield against the unconscious people around you. It transforms into something incredibly powerful. It becomes a quiet, illuminating presence.
I absolutely love this thought. Light does not announce itself. It simply illuminates. A fully integrated perceptive person naturally changes the entire architecture of a room just by existing in it. They don't have to perform their consciousness or aggressively force an indictment on anyone. Simply through their grounded presence, manipulative people suddenly feel exposed. Grieving people feel deeply held, and those living in lies just feel the close proximity of a truth they haven't been willing to face.
Let's bring this full circle back to our 1913 patient. Remember, she arrived in Jung's care feeling completely broken, utterly convinced her sight was a literal curse. But by doing the grueling, rewarding work of individuation, she didn't lose her perception. Instead, she completely changed her relationship to it. She actually became a counselor. The exact same faculty that destroyed her in unconscious systems became a life-saving, empowering instrument in conscious ones. She finally learned how to choose when and how to engage her gift.
So, what is the big takeaway from all of this? It's Jung's core conclusion. You do not need to see less. You do not need to numb yourself or try to manage some kind of psychological defect. You just need to see more wisely and engage more consciously. The real work is to build the internal architecture to carry your perception fully, honestly, and without apology, while always distinguishing what is genuinely yours from what belongs to the collective.
The reality is, the world is always going to have systems built on avoidance, and it will probably always target the one person who refuses to pretend. But you no longer have to pay the price of clarity with your own isolation. Your perception is not a malfunction, my friends. It is a necessary, irreplaceable function. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Will you spend your life standing safely on the shore, fearing your own depths? Or will you step through the threshold, enter the water, and consciously claim your psychological gift? The choice is entirely yours.